Officer Novak, a racist, noticed Danielle's movement from afar. His gaze immediately focused on the scene. There she was, a black woman bent over the seat of a luxury SUV, shuffling through papers, visibly hurried. He frowned, his hand automatically moving towards the belt where his radio rested. "Hey, ma'am, what are you doing there?" he asked, his voice laced with distrust. The woman looked up, clearly surprised and confused. "I'm looking for my bag," she replied, her fingers still rummaging through the mess in the car, her brow furrowed in concentration. Danielle didn't realize at that moment the weight he seemed to assign to the situation. "Please step away from the vehicle," he insisted with an authoritative tone, his hand sliding toward the radio as if about to call for backup. Danielle, slightly irritated, tried to keep her voice calm. "This is my car. I just need to find my bag," she explained, not understanding the reason behind his hostile attitude. "Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking on subscribe and activate the bell to get a notification every time there's a new video." The growing sound of an engine made Danielle pause her search for a moment, and she lifted herself slightly to check. She saw the patrol car slowly entering the parking lot, and by reflex she quickly went back to what she was doing, trying to ignore the police car's presence. She needed to focus on finding her bag before she got even more delayed. However, she could feel the weight of the officer's gaze on her, even from a distance. The patrol car stopped not too far away. She heard the sound of the door opening and the firm thud of boots hitting the asphalt. A cold, harsh voice broke the silence around her. "Hey!" Danielle froze, her fingers still on the seat, feeling a wave of tension run through her body. Taking a deep breath, she slowly turned to face the man now approaching her. The officer, a young white man, stood with a rigid posture and an expression overflowing with judgment. His narrow, analytical eyes scanned her from head to toe as if he already knew exactly what to think of her. His spotless uniform and the way he casually kept his hand resting on his belt, with an air of hidden arrogance, made it clear he wasn't there to listen to explanations. "What do you think you're doing?" The officer's voice was harsh, filled with suspicion, his gaze fixed on her, each word drenched in cold authority. Danielle wiped the sweat off her forehead, feeling uncomfortable in the situation, but took a step back, determined to stay calm. "I'm just looking for my bag," she replied, keeping a firm and neutral tone. "I left it somewhere in here." She tried to maintain control, even though she could feel the tension beginning to dominate the atmosphere. The officer's face grew even more severe, a skeptical look crossing his features. "Do you have any identification with you?" His hand stayed on his belt in a stance that suggested he was always ready for action. Danielle took a deep breath, feeling a knot in her stomach. "As I already told you, I lost my bag," she repeated, gesturing towards the car, hoping he'd understand the situation. "I have an important appointment that I'm already late for." Before she could finish her explanation, the officer interrupted her with visible contempt. "Running late to a meeting, huh?" He raised an eyebrow, his tone loaded with irony. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered, completely ignoring her words. Danielle took a deep breath, holding back the irritation that was growing by the second. She preferred to stay in control, aware that any reaction could complicate the situation. She took a few steps back, raising her hands slightly as if to indicate cooperation. "This is my car," she repeated with a firm yet calm voice. "I'm just trying to find my bag. As soon as I find it, I'll be on my way." The officer, however, seemed unyielding. He narrowed his eyes, approaching with a gaze filled with distrust, almost disdain. "Ma'am, you're acting very suspiciously. Do you really expect me to believe that story about simply losing your bag?" He looked at the SUV as if searching for some clue that she didn't belong there. Danielle felt a surge of frustration but kept her tone firm. "Yes, it's my car. I'm a state prosecutor." She paused, hoping that would be enough to end this absurd confrontation. "I lost my bag and am trying to find it, nothing more." For a moment, the officer looked at her with a surprised expression, but soon an ironic smile spread across his lips. "State prosecutor, really? Do you have any proof of that? Because, as far as I can see, everything points to an attempted vehicle break-in." Danielle held his gaze, determined not to back down, even in the face of his provocative tone. She knew she didn't owe him anything, but at that moment she was willing to do whatever it took to put an end to this situation. "Want more content like this? Then like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell because we always have new content here, and you won't want to miss out." Danielle's jaw tightened as she tried to contain the frustration bubbling inside her. "I already told you, my ID is in the bag," she repeated, struggling to keep her voice controlled, though her irritation was evident. The officer took another step forward, his hand now firmly resting on his holster, his gaze cold and unyielding. "Sure, but now I need you to step away from the vehicle." His voice was icy, each word loaded with authority that he seemed to impose without hesitation. For a moment, Danielle opened her mouth to protest, but something inside her made her stop. She knew what this scene represented, a black woman alone in a parking lot, searching through an SUV without an ID in hand. She knew all too well how that officer and others like him saw her at that precise moment. Insisting or arguing could be like adding fuel to the fire. In silence, she took a deep breath and took a few steps back, distancing herself even further from the car. Her mind worked quickly, searching for a way out without letting the situation spiral out of control. Danielle wasn't scared, but she knew the risk. Situations like this, in a matter of seconds, could turn into something larger and darker. And the officer, instead of interpreting her gesture as a sign of cooperation, seemed to view it as an admission of guilt. He began circling the car, peering inside, examining every detail with his gaze before turning back to her. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from his belt with a swift motion. Danielle's eyes widened, unable to hide her disbelief. "Wait, what? Are you serious? I already told you, this is my car." The officer tightened the handcuffs on her wrists with calculated coldness, completely ignoring Danielle's words. "You're under arrest," he declared, his voice as cold as the metal's touch. Suspected of attempted vehicle theft. Anger bubbled within her, but disbelief seemed stronger. There was her bag, lost somewhere in that car, and yet they were treating her like a criminal. Danielle cast one last look at the SUV before being led to the patrol car, each step fueling the mix of frustration and defiance building in her chest. She knew this wouldn't end here, that this injustice wouldn't go unanswered. Sitting on the rigid, uncomfortable bench in the patrol car, surrounded by stifling air and the scent of old upholstery, the absurdity of the situation gnawed at her. Danielle leaned her head back, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to control the avalanche of thoughts. This wasn't the direction her day was supposed to take. She took a deep breath, feeling her determination turn into a spark of resistance. Through the patrol car window, she could see Officer Mulligan by her SUV, leaning over to examine the interior with a flashlight, despite the bright evening light. The suspicion in his gaze hadn't faded. If anything, it seemed to grow, bolstered by the assumptions he'd already made without knowing a single piece of who she was or the reality of the situation. Danielle let out a long sigh, her eyes scanning the empty parking lot. A few people had passed by, glancing her way as they saw her sitting in the back of the patrol car, but none dared to intervene or ask what was happening. They merely exchanged uncomfortable glances and continued on their way, leaving her alone in that humiliating situation. Suddenly, the patrol car door opened, and Officer Mulligan pulled her out roughly, forcing her to stand and face him. His expression was harsh, marked by disdain. "Still no ID?" he questioned with an acidic tone. Danielle stayed calm, her voice firm despite the indignation she felt. "I already told you," she began, controlling her irritation. "My bag is somewhere in my car. If you let me retrieve it, I can prove who I am." Mulligan shook his head, a mocking smile on his face. "Do you really expect me to believe that? That you're just someone who lost their bag?" He rolled his eyes. "It's clear you were trying to steal that car." Taking a deep breath, Danielle tried one last time, still holding back her anger. "Listen, officer," she began in a controlled tone. "I am the state prosecutor. That car is mine. Check the registration or do a simple check, and you'll see everything is in order." Mulligan's response was a short, mocking laugh. "State prosecutor? Do you think I'll buy that? People like you don't get those kinds of jobs." He looked at her with disdain. "So stop lying, and maybe we can resolve this without any complications." Danielle's jaw clenched, feeling her fury build. "People like me," she repeated, raising an eyebrow in a challenging tone. "What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" Mulligan kept his sarcastic smile, leaning closer, his voice filled with disdain. "Do you think I'm naive? You could have at least thought of a more realistic excuse," he sneered. "State prosecutor? That's a good one. I've heard a few, but this is the best." Danielle looked at him, and the patience she had maintained through years of struggle and overcoming obstacles was wearing thin. Every step in her career, every hurdle faced to graduate from law school, all of it seemed to evaporate in that instant, before this man who wasn't even listening to her. The frustration was about to explode. "This is ridiculous," she murmured, the words slipping out in an involuntary whisper. Mulligan heard her and laughed cynically, taking a step back before signaling for another officer to come closer. "Ridiculous, no doubt. Do you think you can show up here, try to steal a car, and walk away because you think you hold some important title?" He shook his head as if she were a child trying to fool him. "Not a chance." Danielle sighed, disbelief in her gaze. "Why don't you check the plates? You'll see I'm telling the truth." Mulligan shot her an impatient look. "Oh, sure. To give you time to come up with another lie? I know very well how your type acts. I bet you already have a long record, just waiting for this. You think you're smarter than me, but you're far from it." Danielle needed to control every fiber of her being not to respond. It was clear that Mulligan wasn't seeking the truth. He had already labeled her, decided she was a problem that needed to be contained. Every word from him felt like a slap, but she knew that losing control wouldn't solve anything. The second officer, young and visibly hesitant, approached with a notepad in his hands. He looked at Danielle, then at Mulligan, and finally broke the silence. "Everything okay here?" His voice sounded cautious, laden with discomfort. Mulligan threw an impatient look at his colleague, shrugging with a dismissive gesture. "Just a routine arrest," he responded, as if it were the most common event in the world. "She claims to be the state prosecutor. Can you believe that? But, without ID, I'm arresting her for attempted vehicle theft." Danielle felt her fists clench against the cold metal of the handcuffs. With every word from Mulligan, her disbelief and indignation grew. This was real. It was actually happening. "He hasn't even bothered to check the plates," she said one last time, trying to stay calm but with a voice full of firmness. Mulligan turned, giving her a threatening look, stepping closer as if imposing his authority in a calculated manner. "Stop talking now," he said, in a low, sharp voice, "or I'll make sure you regret this. Click on subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you'll be updated on our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing." Danielle bit her lip, holding back the words boiling in her mind. She knew that any response at that moment could worsen the situation. So she remained silent, watching as Mulligan and the other officer exchanged words in hushed tones. Every second of that waiting was a test of her patience, a painful reminder that, here and now, she was not being seen for who she truly was. After what felt like an eternity, Mulligan finally looked at her again, with a smile of cold satisfaction on his face. "The truth will come out at the station," he declared, as if he had complete certainty in his assumptions. Danielle didn't protest. The exhaustion and frustration were immense. The patrol car door closed behind her, and, in an act of resignation, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to regain self-control. She knew this wasn't over yet, that at some point, the truth would have to prevail. But the fact that she had been treated this way from the start was a reminder of everything she had always faced and what she still had to endure. As the car moved through the city, the buildings and streets passed as indistinct blurs outside, and Danielle couldn't shake an unsettling thought. How many people had already gone through this same situation? People without the privilege of the connections and position she had, individuals who were labeled and silenced before even having a chance to explain, to defend their own truth. Danielle knew, with solid certainty, that when this was over, there would be repercussions. Sitting on the cold seat, illuminated only by dim lights casting shadows, she felt the weight of the handcuffs marking her wrists. The discomfort was both physical and psychological. The sounds of the station floated around her. Hurried footsteps, the intermittent ringing of phones, and the murmur of distant voices. That place, which she had known so well in her role, now placed her in a completely different position. It was she, this time, who was waiting, watched with suspicion, treated as if she were guilty. The memory of the last moments was still fresh. Mulligan's face surfaced in her mind, with his expression full of sarcasm and prejudice, the way he refused to hear a single word. She remembered every detail, the arrogance, the utter disregard when she mentioned her position. He hadn't done any checks, hadn't looked at the plates, hadn't checked her background. He had decided she was guilty before even considering any facts. There, between the gray walls, Danielle felt the anger turn into something deeper, a determination. This wouldn't end like this. Danielle tried to adjust on the hard plastic chair, feeling the discomfort of her arms restrained in the handcuffs behind her. Across the room, Mulligan was filling out forms, murmuring with a colleague who occasionally cast indifferent glances her way. To them, it seemed like nothing more than bureaucratic routine, a formality to be completed without any sense of urgency or awareness of the serious mistake they were making. "Hey," Danielle called, attempting to break through the barrier of indifference. "Can I at least get these handcuffs off? This is completely unnecessary." Mulligan didn't lift his head or slow down his writing. "Oh, sure. Just sit tight, and we'll deal with that when we get a minute," he replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Danielle's frustration was mounting, a sense of injustice hard to contain. She had dealt with difficult officers in her career, but never someone so overtly hostile. How was this happening? She was the state prosecutor, and here she was, being treated like a criminal for simply looking for something in her own car. After what felt like an endless wait, Mulligan finally approached, leaning on the desk with a smug smile. He leaned closer to her, with a mocking look. "So, state prosecutor," he began, in a mocking tone that felt like a slap, "ready to confess?" Danielle held his gaze, her anger evident in her expression. "I've been telling the truth from the start. I'm the state prosecutor of this city, and you've made a big mistake. But you're so blinded by your own prejudices that you can't even consider that possibility." Mulligan let out a short, cold laugh. "Prejudice? This has nothing to do with prejudice, sweetheart. It's about you having no proof, acting suspiciously, and making up one excuse after another. You know how many times I've heard that I lost my ID story? Happens all the time. You're not special." Danielle resisted the urge to respond, knowing that every word he said only confirmed what she already knew. To Mulligan, she was just another story to be dismissed, a voice he would never take the trouble to hear. Danielle took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "If you simply ran a background check or looked at the plates, you'd have everything you need. This would already be over." Mulligan straightened up, crossing his arms, his face contorted in an expression of disdain. "Check? Plates? You don't tell me how to do my job. You criminals always think you know it all. You should be grateful I didn't add a resisting charge." Danielle felt her hands tighten in the cuffs, but she held back. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice low and controlled. "When this is over, you'll regret how you handled all of this." He raised an eyebrow, the sarcastic smile still on his face. "Oh, yeah. Think you can scare me? Look, miss, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen it all. And any notion of power you have in your head won't impress me." Danielle gave up trying to reason. It was clear that there was no point in attempting to make him understand. She knew the truth would eventually come to light, but every minute there increased the weight of that bitter experience. At that moment, the young officer from before approached again, handing a clipboard to Mulligan. He cast a quick glance and handed it back without even bothering to read. "Her phone call?" asked the younger officer, his voice almost cautious. "She should already have that right." Mulligan scoffed, as if the idea were ridiculous. "She'll get her phone call when I decide," he muttered, with a sneer. "And what does she think she'll do? Call the mayor?" He let out a bitter laugh, pleased with his own joke. Danielle's frustration had turned into a cold, silent anger. She knew every step of this procedure, knew her rights, and understood that everything here was being handled incorrectly. But more than that, she knew Mulligan didn't care. For him, it wasn't about justice or legality. It was a matter of power and control, and he was savoring every second. Moments later, the door opened, and an older officer, with a weary expression and an aura of calm authority, entered the room. His eyes scanned the room and settled briefly on Danielle, with something that looked very much like recognition, though he quickly concealed it. Without showing anything, he turned to Mulligan. "Mulligan, what's going on with her?" asked the officer, his voice carrying a cautious curiosity. Mulligan, relaxed and visibly confident, shrugged, as if explaining something trivial. "Just another case of someone thinking they're above the law. She's sitting here claiming to be the state prosecutor. Can you believe that?" The older officer raised an eyebrow, surprised. "State prosecutor, is it?" He cast another look at Danielle, this time longer and more thoughtful. Danielle met his gaze firmly. "That's exactly right. If you'd like to check, you'll see that everything is in order," she said, her voice controlled but filled with conviction. There was a pause before the officer replied. He looked at Mulligan with an evaluative glance that seemed to carry a subtle warning. "Maybe it would be wise to check the plates," he suggested, in a neutral tone, almost a command disguised as a recommendation. Mulligan scoffed, irritated by the idea, but nodded as if it were no big deal. "I'll take care of it," he replied, still with a dismissive tone. Danielle kept her eyes on the older officer, a spark of hope igniting, hoping he'd take a more direct approach. But after a moment, he simply walked away, returning to his desk, leaving her in the same situation. Handcuffed, alone, and voiceless, with no one taking a definitive action. She let out a sigh, her gaze fixed on the floor, aware that that phone call was her only real chance of getting help. She needed someone who could resolve this, since it was clear that nothing would change if she relied on the will of those around her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mulligan returned with an even more satisfied smile. "All right, Princess, you want your phone call? Well, you'll get it. Let's see who you think you can call to get you out of this." Danielle didn't respond to Mulligan's provocative comment. She simply stood up as he finally removed the handcuffs, rubbing her sore wrists as she walked toward the phone with firm steps. She knew exactly who she needed to contact. This was far from over. Rubbing her wrists to restore circulation, she approached the metal table where the phone was located. It was an old model, almost outdated, but at that moment it was her connection to the outside. She moved calmly, her back straight and her gaze determined, trying to contain the anger still boiling inside her. Mulligan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, that same ironic, carefree smile on his face, watching as if it were a show. "Come on, we don't have all day," he said sarcastically. "Don't waste any more of our time." Ignoring him, Danielle picked up the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Mark Edwards." "Mark, it's me, Danielle," she said, her voice firm but filled with controlled calm. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and she could almost imagine Mark straightening up in his chair, fully grasping the seriousness of the situation. "Danielle? Where are you? We've been trying to contact you since early." She took a deep breath before responding. "I'm at the police station," she said slowly, keeping her tone steady, though frustration almost slipped through. "I've been arrested." "Arrested?" The disbelief in Mark's voice was evident. "What happened?" Danielle cast a quick glance at Mulligan, who was still watching her with the same condescending smile. "They think I was trying to steal my own car," she replied, her tone loaded with sarcasm. There was a pause, and then Mark responded, his voice filled with controlled indignation. "Stay calm, Danielle. I'll take care of this right now. They'll regret every minute of this absurdity." Danielle held Mulligan's gaze, knowing that Mark's arrival would change the course of this absurd situation. Seeing her friend and lawyer enter the room, the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Mark, always impeccable in his posture, looked around with a restrained expression, a mixture of anger and indignation he reserved only for moments when he saw evident injustice. "Danielle," he said, approaching her. His voice was low but filled with concern and firmness. "Are you all right?" She nodded, standing up from the chair, her eyes fixed on her friend. "I'm fine, but we need to resolve this right now." Mark then turned to the young officer accompanying them, with a severe expression. "I want to speak to the person in charge immediately," he ordered. The younger officer, visibly uncomfortable, exchanged a nervous look down the hallway before stammering, "I'll call someone." Then he left hastily, leaving the two of them alone in the room. Mark looked back at Danielle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Incredible! They didn't even bother to confirm your identity." Danielle nodded, her voice tense and her eyes full of determination. "No verification. Mulligan brought me here based only on his own assumptions." Mark took a deep breath, his jaw clenched in a sign of contained anger. "This is unacceptable." "Leave it to me now," he said in a tone Danielle knew would tolerate no more excuses or abuses. After a few minutes, Mulligan entered the room, still displaying a hint of his usual arrogance, though a slight unease betrayed his expression. He stopped, looking at Mark with an evaluative expression. "So, you must be the lawyer," Mulligan said, trying to maintain the same tone of disdain, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Mark looked directly at him, with a cold gaze. "Yes, I am the attorney for the state prosecutor, and I'm here to understand why my client was detained without any preliminary investigation. This is a blatant case of abuse of authority and racial profiling." Mulligan looked away for a second, but tried to maintain his composure. Well, she was acting suspiciously and didn't have ID. And, after all, who claims to be the state prosecutor without proof? "Someone who actually is the state prosecutor," Mark replied firmly, his voice filled with controlled indignation. "You didn't even check the plates. You didn't do a single check. You thought you could treat her like this based on an unfounded assumption. There will be consequences." Mulligan finally seemed to falter, his confidence worn down by Mark's imposing presence and the seriousness of the situation. Danielle observed the scene in silence, with a firm expression. She felt that, finally, her voice was being heard, albeit through an intermediary, someone who recognized the injustice and fought to restore the truth. "Ms. Lawson, on behalf of the department, I apologize for what happened," the sergeant began, with a seriousness that contrasted with Mulligan's deflated arrogance in the background. "We have reviewed the situation, and it's clear that there was a grave error in judgment by the officer in charge." Mark remained firm next to Danielle, observing every word from the sergeant with a rigid expression. Danielle kept her gaze attentive, but now her anger was replaced by a vigilant calm, a realization that the worst was about to be rectified, though the consequences of this experience would still reverberate. "Officer Mulligan," the sergeant continued, casting a brief, cold look at the officer beside him, "made a series of mistakes. He didn't verify the appropriate information, ignored your word, Ms. Lawson, and treated you in a way that clearly exceeded protocol. Danielle noted Mulligan's wavering gaze, now lacking the same presumptuous confidence. He avoided looking at her, his posture slumped as if trying to hide in the sergeant's shadow. "We hope you understand that we are committed to correcting this error," concluded the sergeant, his voice firm and almost solemn. He turned to Mark. "Your client will be released immediately, and we will review what happened to ensure this never happens again." Mark gave a slight nod, his stance satisfied but still firm. He looked at Danielle, who raised her chin in a discreet gesture of pride and determination. "This is only the beginning, Sergeant," Mark said calmly, his voice carrying authority. "We will take all necessary measures to ensure that this incident doesn't end with just a verbal apology. My client was harmed by personal and prejudiced assumptions, and we're going to file a formal complaint to ensure this is handled properly." The sergeant nodded, offering no opposition. "I understand, and we will do what is necessary to cooperate with any investigation. I can assure you that the officer responsible will face consequences." Danielle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The feeling of relief mingled with a strong conviction that this marked a turning point. Mulligan finally forced himself to look at her, his smirk gone, replaced by a muted expression. There was no more arrogance in his gaze, only the bitter realization that he had underestimated the wrong person. Mark placed a comforting hand on Danielle's shoulder. "Let's get out of here," he said, leading her out of the room. As she left, Danielle knew this was only the first step. The consequences would be much broader than Mulligan could imagine. "Doing your job?" repeated the sergeant, with a sharp tone. "Your job includes verifying information, not acting based on personal assumptions." He paused, his eyes fixed on Mulligan, and continued, "We detained a prominent person without evidence, ignoring her explanation. This is a serious mistake." Danielle observed, maintaining a controlled expression, but inside she felt a mix of relief and indignation. She had done everything possible to clarify the situation, but she was treated as a suspect from the start. The sergeant was finally acknowledging the magnitude of the error. Mark, with a firm expression, stepped forward. "Officer Mulligan, this kind of recklessness and prejudice not only harms innocent people but also puts the credibility of the entire system at risk. As the prosecutor's lawyer, I assure you this won't simply be forgotten." Mulligan clenched his teeth, his face hardened, gaze lowered, refusing to face Danielle or Mark. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured, his voice reduced to an almost defensive tone. "No, Mulligan," said the sergeant firmly. "The right thing would have been to confirm her identity, as you should have done from the start. The right thing would be not to judge a person based solely on appearance and your own assumptions." He sighed, visibly disappointed, before continuing. "For this, you will be suspended while an internal investigation reviews this case. Making this kind of error is unacceptable, especially for an officer with your experience." The tension in the room became palpable. Mulligan, with no other option, nodded, his shoulders slumped. His defensive posture had completely collapsed. The sergeant then turned to Danielle. "Ms. Lawson, once again, I apologize on behalf of the department. I assure you that all necessary measures will be taken to ensure that a situation like this does not happen again." Danielle nodded, maintaining what calm she had left. "I hope this truly means change," she said firmly. "This isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's been treated this way." The sergeant looked at her with respect and understanding. "We'll work towards that." Mark placed a hand on Danielle's shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but she knew this was just one battle in a larger fight. Danielle entered the meeting room with firm steps. Her presence was immediately felt by everyone. The weight of the previous day's events still hung over her, but she had channeled that experience into unbreakable focus. She greeted David Hernandez with a slight, formal nod, then looked at Mulligan, who watched her with barely concealed tension, His face hardened, stripped of the arrogance from before. Chief Hernandez cleared his throat, breaking the silence in the room. "Ms. Lawson, thank you for being here with us. We know that yesterday's situation was unacceptable, and we are determined to correct it in the most appropriate and fair way." Danielle nodded, her voice cold and measured. "I'm here because I believe this error goes far beyond a simple misunderstanding." She directed a direct look at Mulligan, her expression unshakable. What happened yesterday wasn't just a protocol failure. It was an abuse of power rooted in prejudice. Officer Mulligan, you weren't following protocol. You ignored everything I said, based on the idea that someone like me couldn't hold a position like mine. Mulligan clenched his fists on the table, his jaw tight, but he didn't dare interrupt. Danielle continued, now addressing both him and the chief. "I explained who I was. I said who I am and why I was in that vehicle. From that moment, you had all the resources to confirm it. But that wasn't done, and I was treated as a suspect solely because of an issue of appearance." Hernandez shook his head, expressing his discomfort and agreement. "We are reviewing every step of this case, Ms. Lawson. Officer Mulligan will be subject to an internal investigation to evaluate each of his procedures, or rather, the lack thereof." Mulligan finally opened his mouth, but before he could say a word, Danielle interrupted him. "Officer Mulligan, understand. The power given to you is to serve all citizens, not to subject those who don't fit into a prejudiced view." She took a deep breath, controlling her latent frustration, and concluded, "I hope this serves as a reminder, and as an example, that we will not tolerate abuses of power in this city." Chief Hernandez nodded, visibly affected by Danielle's words. "I will ensure this matter is handled with the necessary seriousness. Ms. Lawson, I appreciate your determination. We want to build a Justice Department that respects everyone, and we're going to correct the flaws that allowed this to happen." Danielle rose, casting one last firm look at Mulligan. "I said it yesterday, and I'll repeat it now. Next time, think twice before judging someone without any evidence." As she left, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, finally, something was being done. That meeting was only a beginning, but she knew its impact would resonate within the department and, hopefully, throughout the city. Danielle held her gaze on Mulligan, without looking away for even a second. Her face was calm, but her voice bore the coldness of someone who has endured injustice and refuses to be silenced. "Officer Mulligan, this kind of behavior endangers the trust between the police and the community. Your job is to protect and serve, and that doesn't mean imposing judgments based on prejudice or assumptions." Mulligan averted his eyes, his discomfort now evident. He seemed to struggle with his words, the confidence from the day before shattered by the truth Danielle was throwing at him. "I was trying to do my job," he murmured, but his defense sounded weak, almost pathetic. Danielle let out a brief sigh. "Doing your job?" "Doing your job would have been checking the plates, looking up my identity, doing the minimum checks. Instead, you chose to ignore my words and act on what you believed you knew." Chief Hernandez nodded, understanding the depth of what Danielle was saying. "Officer Mulligan, what you did was more than a misconduct error. It was a violation of our commitment to justice. This suspension is only the first step. There will be a full review of your record and actions. Your conduct will be re-evaluated, and depending on the results, more severe measures could be taken." Danielle paused, letting her words resonate in the room. "This department needs to be accountable, Chief Hernandez. If we don't make changes now, this will continue to happen to others. I'm not here just to ensure my safety. I'm here because all citizens deserve respect, dignity, and fair treatment." Mulligan slumped in his chair, finally realizing the magnitude of his actions. The room fell silent, the weight of Danielle's words filling the air. Chief Hernandez looked at Danielle, respect reflected in his expression. "Ms. Lawson, your courage in bringing this to light is a reminder to all of us that justice must be applied equally. Thank you for your patience and determination in ensuring this gets resolved." Danielle rose slowly, casting one last look at Mulligan. "I hope this experience serves as a lesson, not just for you, but for everyone in this department. Everyone has a story and deserves to be heard." As Danielle walked away, she felt a mix of relief and purpose. She knew this moment marked an important change and that, regardless of her position, she would continue fighting to make justice a reality for everyone. Danielle kept her gaze fixed on Chief Hernandez, with a controlled and determined voice. Firing Officer Mulligan is an important step, but it doesn't solve the systemic problem that led to this incident. This isn't just an isolated case. There is a deeply rooted culture that allows these prejudices to go unnoticed and for unjust actions to be justified as protocol. Hernandez nodded, the weight of truth reflected on his face. "I agree, Ms. Lawson. This incident has revealed flaws that go beyond the actions of a single officer. We plan to restructure our training policies, with a special focus on racial biases and abuse of power." Danielle stood tall, unwavering. "I want to ensure that this is not just a promise. People are affected by these flaws every day, and they deserve a police department that truly protects them, without prejudice." Mark, who had remained silent until then, leaned slightly forward, supporting Danielle's point. "Chief Hernandez, we will ensure that the implementation of these measures is closely monitored. This includes a continuous training program, periodic reviews of interaction cases, and a direct complaint line, with transparency regarding the outcomes." Chief Hernandez took a deep breath, absorbing their demands. "We're willing to work in collaboration to ensure these changes. Our priority will be to rebuild trust with the community, and I know we have a lot of work ahead." Danielle nodded slowly, feeling that, for the first time, they were building something concrete. "These measures are a necessary beginning," she said in a softer tone. "It is essential that every officer understands that respect for everyone's rights is an integral part of the duty they assume." Hernandez cast a final glance at Mulligan, who remained silent, with no one to turn to. "This department cannot continue to tolerate behaviors that foster distrust and hostility. Mr. Edwards, Ms. Lawson, I thank you for your determination in bringing this to light and pushing us to face reality." As they left the station, Danielle felt the weight of the past few days dissipate a little more. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but with this victory, she felt an important step had been taken. She and Mark left with an even stronger sense of purpose, determined to ensure that this change would endure, so that every person would finally be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Danielle held Mulligan's gaze, her expression relentless. She wanted him to understand the impact of his actions, not only for her but for all those who had been treated similarly and had no voice to protest. "Mulligan," she continued, her voice firm and clear, "your role as an officer is to protect, not oppress. Every person you encounter deserves fair and respectful treatment, regardless of appearance, circumstances, or personal assumptions. What happened to me is a reflection of something bigger, and change must start with each of you." Mulligan looked away, visibly uncomfortable, and remained silent. Chief Hernandez intervened, his voice loaded with seriousness. "Officer Mulligan, I hope this experience is not just a lesson for you but a turning point in your conduct as a police officer. Trust between the police and the community is fragile, and you have contributed to weakening it. This must change, and that change starts now." Mark cleared his throat slightly, drawing everyone's attention back to his calm but firm presence. "Ms. Lawson and I will be closely monitoring the progress of these measures. We will ensure that every promise made today is fulfilled. And if it's not, we'll understand that the system still fails to recognize the dignity of all citizens." Hernandez nodded again, as if the weight of Mark's words had fallen upon him. "I understand, Mr. Edwards, and I appreciate you holding us to our commitment. We don't have the right to fail the community, and I will do everything possible to make this department a model of justice." As she rose to leave, Danielle cast one last firm look at Mulligan. "Remember, the power you hold must be used responsibly. You are not above justice." As she exited with Mark, Danielle felt a surge of determination within her. There was a long road ahead, But this was the first of many steps she was ready to take. Ms. Lawson, Chief Hernandez began gravely from the other end of the line. I know we already talked about the situation with Mulligan, but I'd like to discuss the measures we've been implementing since then. I hope you can come to the department today. Danielle took a deep breath, maintaining her firm tone. Of course, Chief Hernandez. I'm available to review the changes and the next steps. As she hung up, she felt the same determination that had guided her to this point intensify. She knew that meetings like this were essential to ensure that the chief's words didn't remain empty promises. Mulligan's dismissal had been one step, but the system still held flaws, gaps through which prejudice and negligence could infiltrate, affecting those who didn't have the same voice as she did to demand justice. Later, when she arrived at the department, Danielle was led to a small, discreet meeting room. Hernandez was already waiting for her, with a stack of documents and reports on the table. He gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Lawson," Hernandez began, adjusting the papers in front of him. "I want you to know that since the incident, we have been conducting a thorough review of our protocols and how we approach racial profiling and intervention practices. We have convened experts for an extensive training program, but we are also expanding our behavior monitoring system to regularly assess each officer. This won't be a one-time thing. We intend to implement this as a new standard in the department." Danielle nodded, watching him attentively. "These are good initiatives, Chief Hernandez. But I want to ensure that there is also a way to listen to the community. People need to know there's an open channel to report incidents and that their complaints will be taken seriously." Chief Hernandez seemed to consider her words before responding with conviction. "I agree. We're in the planning phase of creating a community council. We want it to be composed of members of the city itself so that they can act as a bridge between the community and the department." Danielle felt a spark of hope. This was a strategy that brought a new level of transparency. That's exactly what we need. Transparency and accountability. It's the path to building real trust. At the end of the meeting, Hernandez promised to keep her informed of every stage of the process, ensuring that her oversight would remain an integral part of the changes. When Danielle left the department, the sky was clear, and the city seemed more vibrant. She knew the fight was just beginning, but, for the first time, she had hoped that real changes were on the way. With each step, Danielle Lawson was more determined to transform the system, not only for herself but for all who would continue to seek justice. Danielle absorbed Mark's words, feeling conviction grow within her. She knew that taking a position on the Oversight Committee wasn't just a formal role. It was a rare opportunity to make real the kind of change so many people had longed for. She looked up at him, determined. "You're right," she said with quiet intensity. "If I'm going to be part of this committee, it will be with a clear purpose, to bring those voices and stories directly to the table. I want them to see and hear what's really happening and make sure that no training or protocol is implemented without considering the direct impact on people's lives." Mark nodded, satisfied, seeing the purposeful glint in her eyes. "That's exactly what they need, a force to keep them focused on reality, not on superficial reform." "I know you'll do it." She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts like pieces of a puzzle beginning to take shape. "We'll continue organizing those community forums," she said. "I want to document every story, every experience people share. We need a concrete foundation to reinforce our voice in there. The stories of those people will be our most powerful weapon." Mark smiled, the confidence in his gaze reflecting her determination. "We'll make it happen. I've already established some contacts with support groups that can help amplify those stories. They have media experience and can ensure that the stories reach beyond the four walls of the committee." Danielle felt a spark of hope at the impact they could have, not only for the community but for the system as a whole. She knew the road would be long and exhausting, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a collective force coming together, ready to fight alongside her. "Then it's decided," she said, lifting her chin with renewed confidence. "I'm joining that committee. But I won't go alone. I'll take with me every one of those voices. Mark stood up, pride evident on his face. "And I'll be by your side every step of the way." As he left the office, Danielle turned her gaze to the window once more, fixing her eyes on the busy streets of the city. That fight was only beginning, but now she knew she had something unbreakable. Not only her own voice but the voices of an entire community, united in a cause they could no longer ignore. The transformation was underway, and Danielle was ready to be the force to guide it. Danielle took a deep breath, feeling a wave of clarity and renewal take hold of her. As she sent a message to Chief Hernandez, she reaffirmed her decision. She was willing to confront the system head-on, but on her own terms. It was more than a fight against an isolated case. It was a mission to dismantle a cycle of prejudice and negligence that had persisted for far too long. Looking out over the city from the top of the window, she knew there were many people who didn't even realize how much they needed that change. People who, like her, had been unfairly judged, treated as less than they deserved. Those people would now be heard. The sense of purpose filled her with energy, dispelling any shadow of exhaustion. There was much to be done, but she had never been one to back down. Mark, perceiving the determined glint in her eyes, smiled. "I know this is the beginning of something big, Danielle," he said, his confidence and support reflecting what they both knew. A transformation was coming. "I'm with you, always." Danielle nodded, grateful. "Thank you, Mark. I know this will be challenging, but together we can give strength to the voice of everyone who was ever silenced." When he left, she remained alone in her office, the silence reinforcing the peace and weight of the commitment she had just taken on. She sat down again, letting herself be carried by that sense of purpose, as dense as the air around her. The small victories they had achieved were just the beginning, the foundation of something more solid, a structure she would build with patience and resilience. She knew changes wouldn't happen overnight. Every step would be arduous, every victory a hard-won achievement. But, brick by brick, case by case, she was ready to challenge and dismantle the barriers that prevented so many people from living with dignity and respect. As night fell and the city lights spread across the streets, Danielle felt a quiet satisfaction. Now she was an active part of a real movement, a force within the system that would, little by little, make a difference. Justice ceased to be a distant ideal. It was a concrete struggle, within her reach, and she was ready to fight until the world was a fairer place for everyone. Not a subscriber yet? Join our community by clicking subscribe and activate the bell to get notified every time there's a new video.